How did we get to a point to where something like the Dark Ages was ever accepted into mainstream history? How is this possible? How did we ever find ourselves adding 1,000 years of phantom time to the zeitgeist of history? How does something like this, with so much evidence against it, become enshrined in mainstream chronology? How do we get to this point? This is a serious problem, and it's a serious question that we need to address, because the ramifications of why it exists in our history transcends just the concept of the Dark Ages alone. It's bad enough that we have an entire period of time that essentially does not exist. But what's even worse about this situation is that it is now deeply ingrained into Western society. All right, so we have a couple of problems that we really need to look at, and we really need to feel the gravity of. The first thing I want to point out really fast, if it's not already obvious, is that the Dark Ages is not this weird psychotic theory held up by, dark corners of the internet or whatever, right? These are not random conspiracy theorists saying, oh yeah, look at this 1,000 years that happened. It's totally here. No, we don't have evidence for it, but here you go, and yeah, it exists, right? This is not those kind of people saying that. This is coming from the mouths of people in tremendous positions of power. And they have no problem exclaiming from the top of the roofs that 1,000 years of non-existent history actually existed. Right? And they make these claims based on absolute false positives, zero evidence. At this point, these people are just kind of making it up as they go along. And then, of course, that level of power structure just feeds back into itself, right? So, somebody from Yale will reference somebody from Harvard, and then somebody from Harvard will reference somebody from some other high-level place, and then those three places will just go in circles. Over time, what happens is that what these people do is they create a solid foundation of lies. And that is exactly what the Dark Ages are built on. It's just built on all of these weird ad hoc explanations, zero sources, zero evidence, made up stuff, misinterpreted evidence, right? And science is one of the last things that these people are interested in incorporating into their studies or into their histories, because the second you start to incorporate real science, objective science, right, the Dark Ages goes out the window. So how did we get to this point? How the hell did we get to a point to where the mainstream happily accepts 1,000 years of phantom time objectively built on fraud and lies? The reality of the Dark Ages is that it takes almost nothing to at least immediately call into question the entire concept. You do not have to be a rocket science. You do not have to have a doctorate in some sort of historical studies. It takes basic common sense. And that's it. I mean, that's really it. Basic common sense. And then you could take it a little further and employ extraordinarily basic critical thinking skills. And the Dark Ages is immediately called into question at the very least. Now, these people who are running the show at this point in time, who are spreading this all over our search engines, who are screaming this from, the lecterns in colleges, etc. These people are obviously not employing any of the skills that academia should be requiring them to use. Right? Now, we've already pointed this out in other shows and stuff like that, but the question I wanted to go over here was, how do we get to this point? What were the tools that were used to get people who are otherwise intelligent people? As a side note, that's one of the things that is very important to remember. The people who are championing the Dark Ages, these people are not idiots, right? Generally speaking, these people are intelligent people. You might think it odd that I'm giving these people who are perpetuating a lie credit, but the reality is a lot of these people, more or less, do not understand that they are perpetuating a lie. Now, why are they not understanding that? Like, what if they're smart? How could they possibly then go ahead and tell an obvious lie? right? Well, it's just the decades of psychological conditioning at the society level that all of these people have been indoctrinated by. And I'm not saying this as like a schizo situation. Psychological conditioning is absolutely a real science, and it's something that we need to take into account as historic researchers, not only when we're studying research, because there is a lot of psychological conditioning going on in all eras of history, right? So it's very, very important to understand that this is a real thing that needs to be understood, and you need to admit that it's there, right? Nowadays, there's so much stuff for whatever, well, not for whatever reason, we know why. There's so much propaganda out there that dissuades people from really looking into psychological conditioning that, a lot of people don't think it's real, or that it is a very surface layer thing, right? And most people don't care anyways, right? Most of you are not walking around trying to figure out how to indoctrinate other people around you. However, you actually are doing that subconsciously, whether you know it or not. Anytime you're trying to influence somebody to believe something that you believe, you are going to be using some sort of psychological conditioning tactics. You're just not used to calling them that. So why am I talking about all this schizo psychological stuff? Because when we go and we look at mainstream researchers' work, and these people who are otherwise intelligent, when we look at their stuff, we need to understand where they're coming from, right? These people are damaged psychologically. These people have absolutely been molded into a very specific direction. And it does not matter how intelligent you are. In fact, intelligence is generally used against the target of psychological conditioning. What am I talking about? Well, generally, somebody who feels they're intelligent and are constantly told how intelligent they are, that's also another psychological conditioning trick, they will believe that they are above basic concepts such as falling for psychological conditioning tricks, right? That is like 101 psychological conditioning, and that's the way it is. Why do I say any of this? I know I'm rambling, but why do I say this? Is because I want everyone to understand that this kind of psychology permeates all of history, and it has absolutely been exploited by those who know how to exploit it. So what I want to talk about in this show, I'm finally getting to it. I want to talk about the forgeries that were created back in the day, back in the Renaissance period, because these forgeries did exactly what the psychological conditioning tricks do. The forgeries had the capability to trick otherwise intelligent people into believing whatever the forger was trying to get across. Most people who were victims of the forgeries were the intelligentsia class, right? The people who held higher intellectual positions and who had, the ears of rulers and stuff like that, right? Most of these forgeries were not going to be read by your average person. Not just because the average person may not have been able to read, but because they never would have seen it anyway, right? It's not like these forgeries were mass produced like you can mass produce stuff today. The books were harder to come by. So the only people who are going to see them generally anyway were going to be the perceived intelligent people who had those positions of authority. And then, of course, those people would then filter down the information to the other people around the area, and they would go from there, right? And then, of course, the common person would listen to that person because they believe or had the perception that that person was coming from an intellectual place of authority, right? And so the information would filter back out that way. So what these forgers were doing is something that was, it's brilliant on one hand. They would go out of their way to try to trick, other intelligent people to believe in something that had never happened. Now, you have to remember, back in the day when all of this stuff was going on, nobody had pictures, video recorders, all that crap. You know that. I mean, obviously. But the thing to remember is that records were crap right then, right? We didn't have, huge libraries at every corner full of stuff and things that you could cite, right? There were not all kinds of archaeological digs going on all over the planet to where you could maybe, help figure something else out and prove whatever, the forger was bringing to light was fake. You had no access to any of this. So when some dude shows up with like a voluminous, mountain of books and stuff that he wrote, quote, but he's like, hey, I just found this in a basement. It's from Rome. And if the forger had gone out of their way to make it look pretty authentic, it would be tough to question it. Now, once again, we have to remember that people back in the Renaissance period, when all of these forgeries were coming to light, they did question it. So please do not think that I'm saying that every single forger got away with everything they did. They didn't. And there were plenty of forgeries that were called out even during this time period. However, here's the crux of the situation. The reality is a lot of these forgeries were not being made just for fun. And I'm going to guess that the vast majority of them were not created as a practical joke. The reality is, if a forgery was created, it was going to be used to gain some sort of power, whether that be political power, land power, monetary power. It would have been created to gain something for the forger, or for whoever had commissioned the forger to write the forgery. Right? So it gets complicated like that. It's not as simple, it's not like two dudes sitting in a basement just writing a bunch of stuff and hopefully something sticks. The reality is, during the Renaissance period, there was an entire market for forgeries, right? I mean, it was all over the place. So not only were forgeries being used as a power grab situation, they were also just being used to fulfill people's collections. Because if it's cool to have artifacts from history, you gotta be cool, you gotta have it, right? If TikTok existed back then, God help us, right? Everybody would be filming themselves dancing around, a bust of Socrates or something, right? Or a piece of a column or some sort of a book from ancient Rome, right? They'd be shaking their ass, jiggling around, and they'd be like, look what I got from, ancient Rome, it's my statue. They'd be doing that stuff, right? The whole thing would be filled with that. So basically what we find is a ton of garbage coming out of the Renaissance period and eventually overshadowing a lot of good stuff. And, of course, if the works are being put into the hands of people who can also gain from the forgeries themselves, not just, the forger, but also the person waving around the forgery, suddenly the zeitgeist starts to change because now people can alter it and they have proof, quote unquote, that they can use to change the history, right? So if you want to, lay a claim to a church, now you can do it because you have something that says, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather built that thing or owned this land back then, so I lay a claim to it, it's mine. Here's the documentation, get the hell off my land, and now it's mine, right? That happened all over the place with all kinds of stuff. Now, over the centuries of this, what happens is when that generation dies off, the original forgery and forgy retainer, I don't know, the people who were forging and benefiting. Once that generation, and it was probably, 2 or 3 generations that were really heavy into it, maybe 4. I'm open to, Anyway, the point is, once those people die off, suddenly the next generations, the only stuff that they have left to look back on history with are the forgeries, right? And in a lot of cases, they have no reason to believe that the forgeries are forgeries. So then what happens is that otherwise good people now start to integrate forgeries into the historical timeline. And this is one of the big problems in history. We have a lot of innocent historians just trying to figure things out and using what they've been given, but unbeknownst to them, their documentation is false. So it becomes difficult the further down the line, the more time passes, to start to really figure out which is the forgery and which isn't. To make matters worse, in our own day and age, a lot of these books that are right now, considered legit 100% fact, we are not allowed to test them scientifically. Scientific researchers just don't have access. I mean, it's that simple. And a lot of access, this goes for all kinds of stuff, by the way, in archaeology. There is so much stuff nowadays that nobody is allowed to test. It's pretty corrupt. At this point, the second you're not allowed to perform scientific tests on something, that's the second your eyebrows should be really raised, and that particular artifact needs to go in the maybe pile, right? If we can't test it, we shouldn't be allowed to enter it into the historical timeline. But that is exactly what's happened, right? So that is what's created our timeline. To make matters worse, we now have modern day scientists who now calibrate their studies and their results off of the false timeline generated by potential forgeries or outright lies or power grabs, etc. So we now have one hell of a vicious circle that now has even scientists saying, oh yeah, it has to be true because yes, our tests match what the historians say. Right there, that's a problem. You can't do that. We cannot match we cannot match scientific results to a historical paradigm, which is obviously wrong. Okay, you get the point. I get the point. Okay, we're good. All right, let's get on to the actual history of this. What I'll do is we'll go over some examples of forgeries. We'll go over some of the tactics used to get forgeries in, and we'll just go over examples and stuff, and we'll see where this takes us. All right, so literary forgeries really take place between around the 1400s-ish to the 1800s-ish, right? And you can argue for other little minuscule changes, but those are really the centuries where we start to find all kinds of crazy forgeries coming to light. All right, where to start? All right, let's start with Tacitus. All right, so Tacitus's History of Rome, it was brought to light by Bracciolini 30 years after a Florentine chancellor by the name of Leonardo Bruni wrote his History of the Florentine People. Now, this was a 12-volume book, and he plagiarized the crap out of Byzantine chronicles. All right, now, the political value was translated into economic value by these books, and the market for ancient works reached astronomical prices because of this. Now, it is said that with the sale of just a copy of the manuscript of Titus Livy, Bracciolini bought himself a villa in Florence. So this was no joke. So you have people making money just off the sale of a forgery. That's it. You don't need to do anything crazy. If you're making tons of money off of just writing a book, yeah, people are going to do that, right? That's going to attract some pretty messed up people. No problem. Like, that's just basic. Now, the writings of Tacitus, or the book Tacitus, I should say, is interesting because there's still a lot of mainstream people who hold true to it. They might say, well, maybe one or two sentences is forged, but no, the reality is it's all real, right? And then you have, a lot of other good people saying the exact opposite. So it's still hotly debated, but pretty much everything points more towards the direction of forgery, because at the end of the day, it is almost impossible to scientifically substantiate a lot of the stuff that goes on in that book, right? And that's also something that the people who say that Tacitus isn't a forgery don't want to talk about, because if you press them on it, if you come down to it, they are not capable of scientifically proving that everything in that book is real. We just have to believe it. Even worse, Tacitus supporters will go out of their way to use other works of dubious nature, and they will cite those works in defense, of Tacitus. Now, that's a whole, it's just circular logic garbage, right? You can't do that. And as I just said, if the science doesn't really back you up, why make the claim anyway, right? You can't make that claim. So the fact that Tacitus, the perfect example, the fact that people are willing to hold on to Tacitus as tightly as some do, it's ridiculous. And there's no reason for it. Like, that's the funny part of the whole thing. There is no reason to hold on to this stuff as a historian, as a researcher or a historian. Just look for the truth. That's it. Who cares if Tacitus is fake? Who cares if it's half of it? You can admit that it's fake and you can move on with life. If it's real, fine. But you have got to bring the proof to substantiate that claim. And it has to be solid. And it has to be scientifically based. Now, that may become an impossibility, and I get that, but, that's a reality that historical researchers have to face, and that's why you should never lock yourself into anything. All right, let's keep going. Now, this brings us to one of the main problems that we find with respect to ancient texts and documents. Generally, what I have found, and I looks like other people agree with me as well, is that unless a document has already been proven a forgery, generally the classical studies people will just accept it as authentic. simply because it at least existed back in that time. So they don't even question the authenticity of their documents nowadays, especially. Because if they did, they'd have to start throwing a lot of stuff away. But that is not how we can do history. That is not how historical research is supposed to be done, right? We have to employ the scientific method, especially in our historical studies, right? We have got to question all of the evidence that you're given with respect to any subject. But that's what you need to do. You have got to question it. Nowadays, especially nowadays, that is not happening. So to highlight this point, for example, there was a book called De Consolatione, and it was supposedly written by Cicero, right? So this pops up, in the mid 1500s, and everybody's like, oh, cool, we have a book, it's written by Cicero, and they can start to use whatever's in that book to paint a picture of the historical timeline, right? And they do. Now, these scholars are all happy, right? They've got a nice book written by Cicero. Cicero's outlining some pretty good historical points. Now the historians can start putting stuff together. Everybody's throwing a party, blah, blah, blah. Then a letter shows up. Now, this letter is written by Carolus Sigonius. And this dude was from Italy, around the mid-1500s. And what the letter says is that he admits to forging the De Consolatione. All right, so Cicero had nothing to do with this. We have somebody saying, hey, look, I forged it. Here's the confession. Now, here we find ourselves in a pickle. Now, basically, with respect to this book that was wrote by, quote unquote Cicero, this book is now essentially regarded as a forgery. But it was not regarded as a forgery until they had a literal letter from somebody admitting to the forgery. They were very quick back in the day, and even nowadays, nothing's changed. Literally nothing has changed. But look at how quick they were to take a forgery and immediately start integrating it into the historical timeline. So what this case shows us with respect to forgeries is that it requires like a literal confession for them to take it out of the zeitgeist, right? Or it would need some sort of insane anachronistic problem. I mean, there would have to be something just insanely blatant for them to think it's a forgery, right? But if the work does not conform to this kind of criteria, then the book is going to be generally accepted, right? And now that we have several centuries between when these forgeries were created, and now, right, there's been a lot of time for these lies to marinate. Another example would be Francesco Petrarca, also known as Petrarch, and he was between the 13 and 1400s or so, middle 1300s. Now, this dude is known for faking his discovery of Cicero's letters. Now, I realize there's going to be scholars out there that say, no, these are real. But here's the reality with Petrarch. So, Petrarch finds, quote unquote, finds Cicero's letters. And for whatever reason, Petrarch himself can also write in the exact same handwriting as the original Cicero letters. So that's a problem, right? I mean, like, you have this dude saying, hey, look what I found, and then Petrarch's own handwriting is also identical. You gotta look at that and be like, the problem is stuff like that just, people will let that stuff slide through. To make matters worse with Petrarch, we even have Cicero's letters backing up everything that Petrarch was also talking about, right? So basically Petrarch could say, well, look, Cicero agreed with me. He must be right. So even a mainstream academician has to admit that there is something funny with Petrarch and Cicero's letters. I mean, you can't ignore that, but they do, but you can't ignore that. Don't ignore it. And to make matters even worse in this situation, and this is a problem with all kinds of literary works from the Renaissance, the reality is those manuscripts that are claimed to have been found by Petrarch, they're gone. Like, we do not have those, right? We just have to trust that back in the day, they were legitimate. So this is what scholars are working with, and this is the kind of stuff they are building the concept of the Dark Ages off. I mean, it is objectively corrupt garbage, because what evidence do they have? I mean, they can't even show us the originals, right? I mean, those are conveniently lost. Oh, and by the way, that's another huge thing with the Renaissance period, right? We always find that the originals magically burn up, or they're magically lost, or they are never physically around. It's a real problem when you cannot authenticate any of these claims that are building the case for the Dark Ages. Like, okay. Now, these two examples highlight the serious problem that we run into with respect to the forgeries. Because if a lot of these books are indeed forgeries or even just half-truths, right? Some of these are half-truths. That's the other problem we have to deal with. It's not that every single book is just a 100% fabrication. The book could be like 50% real, 50% garbage. Like, that could be the case. And that makes things even worse, right? Because now you have the possibility of maybe understanding a real event, but then it is poisoned by whatever fantasy was injected in the next page. So basically, we run into a situation where we have problems compounding one another. But it gets worse. So if any of these are pure forgeries or half-truths or whatever, if they're, as long as there's some fiction involved, we now have no way of knowing for sure that the current history that is in the mainstream is real. Because a lot, and I mean a ton of that history, is backed up by these books. Let's take Titus Livy, for example. Now, this guy was an author who was about 100 years earlier than Tacitus. Now, what Titus Livy did is he wrote all of these volumes, 142 volumes, on the history of Rome. Now, Titus Livy's History of Rome covers everything from like 753 BC through the reign to Augustus. So that's a huge chunk of time, right? That's a ton of awesome information if it is real. Now, here is the problem. We now know for a fact that the first 5 centuries of his works are fake. They are all fiction. They're not real. Now, this was proven back in 1738 by Louis de Beaufort, and I'm sorry if I'm messing up that pronunciation, but basically this dude did a critical analysis of all of Titus Livy's books, right? All 142 of them. And he came to the conclusion that the first 5 centuries were indeed garbage. They're not real. They're all made up. And this is accepted, by the way, by a lot of the mainstream. Not everybody accepts it, but it's generally accepted by the mainstream. Anyway, so if the first 5 centuries of this voluminous work of Rome is fake, how the hell do you trust the rest of it? Like, what? How can you do that? You can't, and they do. Mainstream, they still trust all of this. But scientifically, we cannot, right? I mean, it's, today everybody keeps saying that they love science and they follow science. Well, scientifically, we cannot trust, scientifically provably, we cannot trust these works. So then what we now have to do is ask why these people who claim to love science are not following the scientific method when it comes to something like this. In fact, they're not even following common sense methodology, right? It's not even that far. So this is a serious problem that if you believe in the Dark Age timeline, you have to explain why it is okay to accept evidence such as this when we know for a fact that a large chunk of the work is already made up. Why would we or should we trust the rest of the work? This is the question that we do not get answers for from the mainstream. The stratigraphy is not on the mainstream side. We know that scientifically. The analysis of the literature that the mainstream uses to claim they have an understanding of the timeline, and for which the timeline is generated from, is also provably fake in countless instances. All right, I'm going to wrap this up because we're coming up on time. So basically, we have a problem in the Renaissance period with ungodly amount of fraudulent documents being used to create the Dark Ages timeline and other timelines as well, right? It's not just, the Dark Age situation. But, the reality is what we've done is we've proven scientifically that there is no reason to take those documents, those works at face value. We cannot do that. Once we stop doing that, the Dark Ages goes exactly where it belongs. And that is in the trash can.